May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Imagine walking around creation with those lucky first few. God made nothing into something, and it is very good. Look around. Squint at the sun governing the blue sky day. God gave us the sun, and it fuels the earth. Enjoy the giant oak unfurling emerald leaves and the wispy clouds. The sun powers every cell in that tree, letting it pump water from deep underground. Try burrowing through the soil where you can see roots dancing with the life-giving loam. This is the charity of sunshine and plants. God said they are
very good.
Very good. Feel the rich, dark soil tickling your toes, cushioning your feet. Scoop up a handful and drizzle it between your hands. You just brushed 1,000 living things. They root around underground, turning old bodies into new soil, breathing new life into the garden. This is dry land, and God said it is good. Listen. Can you hear the sweet water gurgling past mossy stones? Follow the stream as it passes over a waterfall into a bubbly blue lake. Cup your hands for a refreshing drink. No salt. That's because every drop in that lake came from the ocean. It had to evaporate and swoosh through the clouds, fall as rain, drip and filter through the soil, and splash into the lake before we could drink it. The sun drives these cycles, keeping us alive, keeping us refreshed. Thanks be to God. Dive into the lake. Be soothed as the water glides over your skin, head to toe. Open your eyes and watch beaver and fish and lily pads and bugs frolic among watery sunbeams. Swim across the lake, rest on a smooth, sun-warmed rock, and trace the river that carries this sweet water to the river and to the ocean. Smell the salty sea breeze and glimpse the shoals of fish gorging on the river mouth's nutrient buffet. Watch the dolphins and the otters and the whales chomp the smaller fish. This is water and life, and God said they are very excellent. Take a deep breath. Taste the crystal air as it runs over your tongue. The oxygen in the air came from billions of tiny ocean creatures whose breath created our atmosphere. Wide-eyed and speechless with gratitude, we listened to God's instructions for creation care.
God blessed them, and God said to them, "Have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
Now, God had options for that opening sentence to all of humanity. Just think of all the wisdom throughout the entire Bible. And the first thing God has to say to us is how to care for the garden. In these first breathless words, God welcomes us to earth and teaches creation care. What exactly is God telling us in this user's manual for the planet? What is God saying to us in the sixth day of creation? You see, God shares creative power with us, and everything that God creates is good. So defiling creation is a sin. And this comes up in Numbers because God commands the Israelites to, quote, "defile not the land which you shall inhabit." As Genesis gives us sovereignty over creation, a close reading of that word dominion helps us understand how we are to care for this fragile earth, our island home. Dominion comes from the Hebrew word radva, which means caregiving, even nurturing, but not exploitation. It's fascinating to watch the way the Hebrews use the word radva when they're talking about their leaders. They often use it when they're describing a beloved governor or king. And sure, the king could rule with an iron fist and could hoard the food and could restrict the water and could take everything he wanted and forget about the next 50 years or 100 years. But those kings tend to lose their heads in revolutions. Those kings don't stick around. And when the Hebrews use the word radva, They're talking about caregiving, even nurture, but not exploitation. And through this verb, radva, Genesis calls humans to treat creation the way God cares for us, with love and with wisdom. So when we wound the creation that God calls so very good, we abuse our God-given sovereignty. And friends, the truth is we are spoiling our beautiful home. Almost every indicator of environmental health shows serious decline, with the exception of the ozone hole. But I want to focus today on food justice in our community. And we focus there because, as we talked about yesterday, it's a window of opportunity for us to make God's love real in our time. It's a window of opportunity for us because we have 140 properties in some of the world's best growing conditions. We have an opportunity here and now to steward our land, to conserve our water, to feed the hungry, and to love neighbor as self. And of course, there's more to do. But food gives us a unique and a powerful place to start. So yesterday we talked about food as a blessing, because food comes from God's creation, and stardust plus time equals us, we said. And so with every bite of food, we are literally eating hunks of universe. We said food equals power, because food equals survival. And we talked about the distortions that make bacon double cheeseburger cheaper than fruit and vegetables. And we talked about that story where Joseph has so much power because he has control of the food, and he uses that to make justice in Egypt. We said food equals nourishment because it gives us a chance to thank God every time we dine. Think about the chance to thank God every time we have a table grace. We said food equals reverence for God from whom all blessings flow, and we sang that gorgeous hymn, the Old 100, which comes from the 11th century in France. And we said food equals dependence on God, and that's really hard to acknowledge, dependence is. If I'm honest, it's hard for me to remember that I depend on God all the time. But food helps us do that. Food reminds us that we depend on God. Every time we eat hunks of universe, we depend on God. And we said food equals a symbol of grace in the Last Supper because in the Last Supper we both convey and accept, in Elliot Wright's words, God's grace. And so through the loaf and the cup this morning, we will accept God's grace, we will receive God's nourishment, and we will feel God's kick in the pants. Because we said food equals community, breaking bread with someone is the quintessential act of relationship. And because food equals community and because food equals culture, it's an incredible opportunity to break walls, to end divisions, to extend God's radical hospitality to every corner of Los Angeles. And just imagine the conversations that could emerge if we built partnerships for gardens and farms and food shelves and harvesting on 142 properties in some of the best growing conditions on earth. Imagine the theological work that could happen if we grew our own wheat and our own grapes. Yesterday we also talked about food as a marker for broken relationship with ourselves and with God and with each other. And we talked about how greed leads to overabundance for some and scarcity for others, and we talked about that very strong link between climate justice and food security, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We said food can mark love rejected and grace denied. We considered the prodigal son, and we wept over his self-imposed quarantine from grace. We said food can mark communities shattered and relationships broken and illness spreading. We considered food deserts where fast food is cheaper and more available than food that nourishes. And we said if food can mark broken relationships with God and self and other, is it possible that through God's grace we could be instruments of reconciliation, that through God's grace we might begin to restore these broken relationships, that we might be instruments of God's grace and God's love. And we considered Jesus' summary of the law where he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your soul. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And we looked at today's gospel reading, where in separating the sheep and the goats, the righteous ask, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, thirsty, and naked, and in prison? And Jesus answers, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, You did it to me. And reading the gospel this week, I'm struck by that phrase, members of the family. Jesus isn't talking about service in the demeaning sense of the word. I don't think he imagines wealthy folks bending down to serve the poor just so we can go back to our mansions and dine finely with a little bit less guilt. Maybe caviar with a nice little prayer. I think Jesus is talking about life-changing, mutually beneficial relationships that are rooted in love, the kind of love we feel for our families. And Jesus said, just as he did it to the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And so we are called to reconcile broken relationships with ourselves and with God and with each other. And food gives us a point of traction to do that, even leverage to get started. Because in the 21st century, with 9 billion people in a very harsh climate expected by 2050, we can only love neighbor as ourselves when we work with everything we have for stable climate, and for just society, and for food security. But all of this so far has only been talk. And talk's cheap. Today's about action, because that's what Jesus calls us to do in the gospel. So when we meet God at the table this morning, we feel God's love and all of its power, power to soothe, power to disrupt, and power to restore, and we have work to do. And I thought it would be fun to get our playbook from the Acts of the Apostles. So if ever there was a community that faced daunting odds, work to be done in the face of unspeakable odds, where all you can do is everything you can all the time, it was the early Christian church. Check out how radically open they were. Paul has a dream, and some guy says, hey, Paul, come on over. That's actually what the NRSV says, come on over to Macedonia. So they sail through Troas and Samothrace and past Neapolis, and they end up not in Asia Minor, where they were all very comfortable and they all knew where to get food and they all knew where to sleep. They go to Macedonia, totally outside of their comfort zone, and they spend days there, and they meet people with purple hands because they're dyeing cloth the whole time. I love the sacred possibility of flying by the seat of our pants. I love what's possible when we don't know what's coming. We go off book. When we say, God, lead us, we don't know what's coming, but you're in charge, and we love you, and you are the boss. I love the sacred possibility of flying by the seat of our pants. And just think what happens in the early church and throughout the history of our church. People being willing to let God lead, being willing to start anyways. And so that's what we're going to say together at the end of this. All the reasons not to start, all the reasons to hold back, all the reasons to play it safe. That's not what Paul did. And that's not what Jesus calls us to do. They call us to start anyway. So what if you've never seen any of this before? Start anyway. What if this might be hard? Start anyway. What if there's dirt involved? Start anyway. How are we going to pay for it? Start anyway. Who's going to pull the weeds? Start anyway. What if animals eat the vegetables? Start anyway. What if it makes the neighbors angry? Start anyway. Where are we going to keep the tools? Start anyway. How do we find people to eat our food? Start anyway. How are we going to find people to harvest our food? Start anyway. Where are we going to put the food? Start anyway. We can't agree on what to plant. Start anyway. I'm too busy and I don't have enough volunteers. Start anyway. Because when you start anyway, it's incredible the possibilities that emerge and the partnerships that grow out of the soil like wheat that springeth green. Let's dare to be like Paul in the early church. Let's follow God's whimsy and let's see what possibilities emerge, what relationships grow, what love we encounter, what God has in store for us. Yes, dear people of God, let's jump in and let's ride the sacred possibility of flying by the seat of our pants. Plus, Tim's here, and he's really smart, and he'll probably help us out. So today's about action. Today's about jumping in and making something happen. Let's start anyways. Thanks be to God. Alleluia, alleluia. Amen.